everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy. This is a part of our series on historical analogies, and this is the 14th installment. So today we shall be talking about the connection between style of Impressionism and action painting. Now, action painting is separated from abstract expressionism, though these two are often used interchangeably, but we do choose to look at it as its own thing, as a different thing that is separated from the whole of abstract expressionism. We already discussed this. Now, when we're talking about its connection to Impressionism, we shall constantly have in the back of our minds that we have already connected Impressionism to Gothic style, and that these two are very important, so that these two are linked in a very important manner, that they communicate in a very important manner. So when we're talking about the connection between action painting and Impressionism, we are also to a certain extent talking about the connection that action painting has with Gothic style too. So I would like to invite you to regard and to think about and to watch our previous installment, the one that is dedicated to Gothic style and Impressionism, if you want to have a better understanding, a more fuller understanding of what we are going to be addressing today. Now, the reason why we think this connection is so important, the reason why there will always be a Gothic style and a Gothic mind frame, really a Gothic worldview in the background of this conversation, is this whole idea of struggle and of pain and of, to a certain extent, violent aspect of this particular style. We are not only talking about aesthetics, we're talking about deep layers of symbolism here. So what I'm trying to address here when I'm talking about violence and confrontation is how light is presented to us in Gothic style, and how light is presented not only in the form of a stained glass window, but truly inside most of Gothic churches and cathedrals. So I'm referring to the fact that Gothic style is all about light, as we know, but the darkness has a very important role in all of this too. Light is contrasted to darkness, and light really comes and shines forth, no pun intended, thanks to darkness. So we can truly better understand light if we compare it to darkness. And this is very evident in many Gothic churches and indeed many Gothic cathedrals, especially in Notre Dame of Paris, because in this particular place, light and darkness are used to a great effect. We have a very luminous rose window, well, three of them really, but I'm really talking about the north one and the south one that are situated in the transept of the church. So these two rose windows are so impressive because they are surrounded by darkness, relatively speaking. Now, when you're talking about this particular cathedral, and indeed many other Gothic churches, you are talking about this division that exists between the ground floor that is fairly dark and the upper deck that is fairly well lit. So we have this idea of clashing between light and darkness, and this is very obviously something that refers to the clashing of good and evil, of body and soul, of matter and spirit, and you get the point, right? Light is good, darkness is bad. So this is very simplified, but it is what it is. So if we're talking about this entire thing, we're talking about the fact that, again, we can only truly understand light if we compare it to darkness. So light really defines itself with darkness, and it's this idea that you define yourself with your other, with the capital O. You define yourself through your enemy, through your arch nemesis in this particular case. Now, this particular division is even more clearly presented not in Notre Dame de Paris, but in Sainte-Chapelle. So when you go to Sainte-Chapelle, you can see that two floors of this chapel are divided, physically divided. So the ground floor is very dark by intent. It represents the earthly realm, and the upper deck, the first floor, how the Europeans call it, or the second floor, how the Americans call it, is very luminous. Indeed, most luminous. It's flooded with light. So not only do you get this difference between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm, you get it translated to the social structure of this particular period, because the upper deck, the first or the second floor, whichever you want to name it, was reserved for the king and the royal family, whereas the ground floor was reserved for its guard and socially less elevated people. So back in the medieval period, there was no way to communicate between these two. They were physically separated, not only by a different floor, but indeed there was no way to come from the ground floor to the upper deck. It was only in the 19th century that they built the small staircase that is there now and that we can use today. So what is physically separated in the Sainte-Chapelle is brought together in Notre Dame so that it can clash, so that we can see the contrast between these two things. Now, this idea of clash and of contrast is something that is very, very important for a style of Impressionism. and indeed something that is very, very important for action painting. It truly is the kernel of both of these styles, and something that we're going to be discussing at length. Now, we need, before we continue talking about the fight and about indeed warfare or dialectics, if you will, because those are all legitimate ways to address the confrontation that defines these two styles, we need to say that action painting was indeed very deeply influenced by the work of two famous thinkers. I would hesitate to call them both scholars, but very, very influential thinkers. I'm talking, of course, about Freud on one end and Jung on the other. So we're talking about the 40s and the 50s and the 60s of the 20th century when we're talking about action painting. And we're talking about Freudian and Jungian ideas being very widespread and indeed being very influential. So on one end, we have this idea of archetypes. We have this idea of division of the human soul, if you will, or the human character of the human psyche in three different strata. This is very Freudian. We have id, ego, and superego. On the other end, we have this Jungian idea that is very, very important. I would argue for the totality of the 20th century, but in this particular context especially, this is the idea of the collective subconsciousness. So this is the idea of certain archetypes, certain themes, certain tropes that are shared by humanity in a very global, universal manner. So this is the idea that we respond to certain stimuli without exception. Every human being, regardless of its context, regardless of its history, culture, etc., will respond to these archetypal images because they are deeply ingrained in our very essence. And our essences rather, are all connected into one. Now, we're not going to get into this. This is a whole other topic. We can dedicate many, many hours to the notion of the archetype as it was defined by Jung, and to the notion of global shared subconsciousness. There are many issues with this particular take, but we can safely say that it was very influential, and it remains to be that way. Now, we want to go back to this whole idea of struggle and of fight. And of course, if we're talking about the context of Impressionism, which is second half of the 19th century, let's say from the 70s of the 19th century anywhere to arguably World War II, really, because Impressionism lasts well into World War I and after it. So we are talking about a very, very politically important period. And of course, the same can be said if we're talking about the period after World War II. These are all very, very politically pregnant and deeply important periods. So what I'm trying to say is that these periods are very political. This is the moment where art becomes and is then again reaffirmed as being political rather than sacral, or if you will, sacred. So these are periods when again and again art is confirmed to not belong to the church, but rather to belong to the state, and more to not even belong to the state, but rather to belong to the private initiative, to private galleries, collectionaries, and indeed private capital. So if we're talking about this, we're talking about this premise that art, this is, by the way, one of the very legitimate ways in which you can interpret all of art. Art is there to be a reflection of its own period. So if we are to look at these particular two arts as reflections of their period, there's a lot to be said about their particular ideological inclinations and about their politics, because both of these are very engaged, most engaged indeed. Now, we want to be talking about the notion of the battle, the notion of fight. Indeed, both of these see themselves as revolutionaries. They see themselves as revolutionary art, and they're trying to usher in a new world. They're trying to bring forth something that wasn't there before. And so I want to take two examples from two prominent figures, and I want to compare them. So on one end, I would like to discuss the painting, perhaps not as well-known painting of Monet, because it comes from the very beginning of his career. So, and on the other end, I want to discuss not that well-known painting, or at least to me, by Pollock. So, of course, many people will say, oh, these are famous paintings, what are you talking about? Yeah, they may be. I'm talking about the fact that they're not as famous as some other ones. So, to the point, we have Monet's painting that I want to discuss. It's called The Corner of an Atelier, and it's a painting where we can see Monet still developing his style. So, he's still looking for himself. He's not really quite there. This is not yet the Monet that we talked about when we addressed connection between Gothic art and Impressionism. It is not a fully developed Monet who is invested in light, who is invested in basically speculating the very essence, the very core of reality, of subjectivity, and he's not doing that through style. But this is already Monet who knows that he's going to a fight. And he knows that he's starting a revolution, he's starting a war, indeed, the one that is fought with paint, not necessarily with weapons. Now, if you look at this painting, and it will be presented on the screen while we talk about it, you can very simply see that we have equipment for a painter. So we have painting materials, brushes, paint, frames. They are presented on a table. On the wall behind the table, we see very colorful, I would say kind of kitschy, and I would think this is intentionally made that way, wallpaper that is fairly orientalist, that is fairly exotic, kind of cheap looking. Again, I would argue, this is my subjective take. But most importantly, on this wall, on top of this wallpaper, we have a long dagger and we have a pistol. So leaned against the wall next to it is what looks to me like a rifle as well, like a rifle barrel. So we really have this idea that this entire painting is a manifest. It's a battle manifest. It's a war manifest, if you will. And what the artist is doing here, he is very on the nose with the message. He is basically saying that art is going to war. And he is saying that his particular choice of weapon is not what usually is seen as such. So he is not for swords, he's not for pistols, not cold or warm arms. He is choosing paint. Now, when we look at the painting palette that is presented here, when we see brushes and the colors he uses, we can see that the dominant space is occupied by something that is not a color, though we like to think of it that way. This is white. So you know that white and black are not colors. Doesn't really matter. So we have a painting palette here with a lot of colors, and we have a very dominant space being occupied by white. Now, you can imagine that this is a very simple message, and what Monet is trying to suggest here is that white stands for light. Truly, if you want to bring more light into your painting, you will use white. You will use white to dilute outer colors in a way to make them brighter. So this is really important for Impressionists because they want to make their paintings brighter. We've talked about this when we spoke about Impressionism. We talked about this when we spoke about Pointillism, and especially Divisionism. This is also going to be a topic of our next conversation that is specifically going to be on the topic of Divisionism and the optical art or op art. So it's this whole idea that you want to infuse your painting with more light. And this is really Monet telling us that light is his weapon of choice. So not just colors, not just paintbrushes, but specifically the way in which he represents light. So we can see that this is a very much a manifest, that this is a statement. So this is the way that Monet begins his career. And we know that his career was fairly scandalous, fairly problematic. He had his ups and downs. He was not always accepted. He was not always as respected as he is today. He had to gradually come into acceptance. So on the other end, I want to talk about Pollock painting that is called War, 1947. So this is one of the very rare Pollock paintings, first of all, that has a clear title, and second of all, that would have a figural representation of pretty much anything. Now, we know that the whole Pollock aesthetics, and we're going to be talking about it in great detail today, is very much about not representing anything. It's aformal or anti-figural. So this is not figurative art. He is not representing anything. Well, here he is, because this is one of his earlier works. And we can see that, funnily enough, Pollock, we know, was very much against Picasso. We did a whole thing on this topic of just how anti-Picasso Pollock was. But here we have a painting of Pollock that is clearly influenced by Picasso's work. So we can see clear influences of two Picasso's paintings. One of them is, of course, his famous Guernica. The other one is A Dream and a Lie of Franco, which is, of course, very critical of Spanish fascist dictator, or rather Spanish fascist leader, Generalissimus Franco. So it's this whole, I would say, visible influence of Picasso that is present in Pollock's work. So we have a very large pyre. We have a very large bonfire that is made mostly of human bodies, human skulls. We have people basically being tossed on top of this pyre, both people and animals. We can see a very prominent figure of a bull in the background, and this is, of course, reminiscent of Picasso. We know that Picasso and bulls, that's a really big deal. They share many connections, and bull is prominently present in Picasso's work. Then we have in the right corner of the painting something that can be interpreted as a crucifixion, as a Jesus-like figure. And we have this overall very violent statement that we can argue is anti-war. So this is really interesting because all of Pollock's aesthetics was about struggle. Now we go back to this idea that these two paintings are not really that much about war, but they are about confrontation, they are about struggle, and they're about this idea of a fight that is really, really important. Now, when we're talking about this in political terms, we can say that on one end, we have Impressionism being a very bourgeois art, and that this is the fight that the bourgeois are taking to the aristocrats. So this is basically republic against monarchy. And this is the fight we're talking about. It's a class fight. It's a class struggle. So we have this idea that the bourgeois are trying to define their own world. They're trying to create their own culture. And their culture is very different from the culture that already existed. So they don't want to live in a theocratic monarchy. They don't want the church to be the main impulse and the main ruler and the main lawgiver of their society. They don't want kings as divine figures. They don't want any of these things. They want to live in a man-made, man-ran, man-shaped, human-shaped rather, republic. And this is a very big deal because we not only talk about different political organization, we're also talking about a different economic organization, because Impressionism basically comes as the formulation of industrial capitalistic art. And a previous style that they're fighting against really speaks of monarchical aristocratic society that for centuries was based in agricultural feudalism. And this is a very different thing. So you could say that these both have very, very specific political and ideological backgrounds. So this is on the topic of Impressionism. On the other end, we have action painting that is very much about American capitalistic society, about their idea of individuality and the idea that they're opposing to Soviet collectivism, to Soviet communism that is present and formulated in suprematism and constructivism. So this is the idea that we have both of these artistic formations very clearly made against something. So they're not made to be something in their own right. They're made as a reaction to something that is already there, and they're made as a direct challenge to that great other that is defining them. So we cannot overstate the connection between ideologies and political formations that are behind these two styles, and we cannot neglect their importance and their similarity. So we have this whole idea of individualism. Now, we spoke about this when we spoke about Impressionism. Of course, there's a lot more to be said on the topic. Individualism is a very, very important thing because Impressionists are basically fighting against the machine. So they want to say that they're giving something to the world of art, they're giving something to spectators, to the audience, that the machine cannot do, that the machine cannot give. So they are competing against photography. The whole idea is that camera produces images that are very faithful renditions of reality, but these faithful renditions of reality do not have a soul. They don't have a comment. They don't have all these things that only humans have. So these paintings, images, photographies are perfect in one end, but on the other, they are objective, they are soulless, and they're not, in fact, artistic. So the idea is that Impressionists are offering a different idea of art. They're offering art that is subjective. So for something to be subjective, of course, it needs to be individualistic, because what defines one subject from the other is their individualism. On the other end, we have action painting being very much invested in individualism because they are opposing this to Soviet collectivism, to this whole idea of communist collectivism. So they too are insisting on individualism, albeit for slightly different reasons. But they go back to the same point. Their art is a festivity, is a manifest of individualism. So there's a very strong connection in this particular regard. Now, when we come to this whole point of how they're portraying individualism, how they're portraying subjectivism, we're also going back to something that we already mentioned and something that we shall mention again because it is really important. We're talking about aesthetics of Benedetto Croce. So we're talking about this particular idea that the artist is conveying the creative process. So this is how Croce reads art, and this is how he defines aesthetics, and this is what he sees as valuable in art. This capacity for a work of art to bring back the artistic process, the creative process. Now, we are going back to this premise of fight, of struggle, of pain and confrontation, something that goes back to Gothic art, because for action painters, creative process is a struggle. It is painful. It is hard. It is filled with anxiety. It is filled with riddles and labyrinths. It's not joyful creation. It's not creation as Picasso saw it to be, a childlike play of pure creativity and pure wonder, of innocent exploration of the world. Not at all. It's a struggle. It's something that is immensely difficult. So it's much closer, if you will, to how French poet Mallarmé defined it. He was famous for having this terrible anxiety of a white page of paper, white piece of paper. How do you fill this dreadful whiteness? You have this empty void in front of yourself, and you have no inspiration. You don't have a single idea what to do. You're basically pushing your mind through this train, and you're trying to create something. So poor Mallarmé had a very hard time of creating, and the creative process for him was exceptionally miserable. It's a whole thing. So you could say that these people see the creative process in a very similar fashion. It's a constant struggle. And this is the whole thing with Pollock. For him, creative process is a struggle. So we can say that this Benedetto Croce notion that art is supposed to convey us the state of mind, the creative process of an artist, well, this is the type of message that we are getting. This is the state of mind that is being conveyed to us through action painting. It's pain, it's struggle, and it's a very miserable experience that wrenches our soul, indeed our entire being and our minds. Now, we need to connect this idea of Benedetto Croce to a set of ideas that is that belongs to another art historian and theorist, Harold Rosenberg. So this is a person that defined a lot of action painting and who also was very active in defining a lot of abstract expressionism and was a very important figure in this entire context. So there is a very famous statement by Rosenberg who claims that painting is an arena. Now, this is obviously taking us back to this entire idea that art is struggle, that art is war, that art is all about fight. You are making a fight. You are fighting when you are creating. Art is also there to fight. Now, we can connect this to a set of theoreticians that were immensely important in the second half of the 20th century that we know as the Frankfurt School. So people like Marcuse, like Adorno, like Horkheimer, etc. So these people argued that class and ideological fight, struggle if you will, is no longer necessary present in the field of economy and in the field of politics as it was up until that moment and as it was in most of the 19th century and early 20th century. Now this struggle, this battle for ideological dominance is basically situated in the field of art. Now, they were very famous for stating that this is not happening in the field of high art or fine art, whichever you prefer, but it's taking place in popular art, pop art. So it's taking place in the field of, let's say, rock and roll music, Western cinema, things that were not seen as high art. So it's not in the domain of sculpture, painting, poetry, high arts, sophisticated, elevated, etc. Domains. No, this is basically taking place in the field of popular art that is flooding the market, that is flooding human consciousness, really the entire culture, through new means of communication that we didn't have before. So we didn't have television be that present, that influential, and that important politically as well as culturally before World War II. Then, after World War II, we started having it. A lot of people, even very poor people, were able to own a television set, and more have. Now, seeing how we're recording these in, already March of 2025, we can say that television is arguably not as important anymore as it was in the second half of the 20th century, and I would say beginning of the 21st. So it may be a bit difficult for us to properly estimate the reach and ideological and political and cultural imprint that television has left on indeed our history, on our entire existence. But it was indeed very important. So we can say that the Frankfurt School placed this immense importance into popular media, but we can also say that their theory is applicable to what we are dealing with here. We are dealing with this notion that painting is an arena. Now, we can be more general about this. We can say that popular music is also an arena. We can say that popular or general literature is also an arena. Let's stay with the domain of visual arts here, because this is what we are discussing. We are discussing the connection between Impressionism and action painting. So when we're looking at Impressionist paintings, we're looking at very strong political statements. So if you were to go to famous examples of Impressionist art, let's say Bal au Moulin de la Galette by Renoir, you are truly talking about the political manifest. You are talking about a painting that represents the life of a bourgeoisie, a lower middle class, not high class people, not high class bourgeois, not very wealthy people, not even middle class people. We're talking about really lower middle class up to middle class. So we're looking at a very strong political statement of how these people live, how they interact, how they see the world, and how they exist in the world. We see a weekend spent in Montmartre where people come to listen to music, they come to drink together, dance, chat, make new acquaintances, gossip, and all these other things that people do. So when you look at this painting, you can see several different layers of it. First of all, you can see that visually, again, we are talking about fight, we are talking about struggle that is present in its treatment of light. So you look at this painting, you can see the light is very comparable to that of a Gothic church or a Gothic cathedral. We can see light literally going through leaves, flickering leaves, and falling in dots on people that are in the painting, the same way that light goes through stained glass windows and falls on the interior of the church, on walls and the floor. So you can see light animating this entire scene the same way as it does in a Gothic church. But you can also see that there is this big clash between light, and I wouldn't necessarily say darkness, but I would really say light and regular color. This is all about interaction between light and color and shape. So we have this whole thing that light is shaping this entire scene, as is the case in a Gothic church, the interior of a Gothic church. So we can say that this particular treatment of light has a lot to do with what we were just talking about, politics of this painting and politics of the entire genre, the entire stylistical formation. Because this stylistical formation of Impressionism, and this is a maturely Impressionist painting, is giving us a window into how lower middle classes of Paris in this particular moment are living. And this particular moment is the 70s of the 19th century in Paris. We have this representation of a very casual, very banal, everyday occurrence. It's important to state that what we see here is not a coronation, it's not a great battle, it's not a revolution, creation or destruction of an empire. So not a tremendously important historical event. It is not a tremendously important religious event. Now, we know from art history that many paintings and statues are made on topic of gods or a god, or in the Christian optics, saints, martyrs, biblical characters, and so on. None of those are present here. So here we have the most ordinary, most casual weekend they that is represented in the most casual manner. And perhaps counterintuitively, this is the most combative aspect of this entire painting, because it is talking about something that is ordinary. Because the entire idea of art was that it's supposed to be extraordinary. It's supposed to talk about beautiful events, that it's supposed to talk about eternal truths, about elevated spheres of existence, of something that is eternal, of something that is truly immensely important. And this particular take on things is very provocative, because it's talking about something that is very ordinary. And you can say that this is the same thing that takes us back to action painting, that takes us back to this idea that not only that these people will not represent immensely important things in most cases, they will not represent things at all. They will completely escape from the topic, they will completely escape from meaning and from representation itself. So they're not going to deal with anything. And the same way that Impressionism is trying to release itself from ballast of meaning, of importance, of grandeur, of religious inspiration, religious zeal, if you will, action painting is trying to release itself from all of meaning, from all of formality. It's trying to release itself from everything. So you can see how these two have the same premise in mind, only action painting takes it steps further, and it's trying to basically liberate itself from pretty much everything. Now, we have this very important topic of struggle, of battle, and of violence. So this is something that we need to address. So we need to address that violence and struggle are not presented the same way as they're mostly presented in pre-modern history of art, in pre-modern art. Now, when we're talking about pre-modern art, we are mostly talking about sacral or sacred art, and we are talking about a lot of violence being present thematically. Now, you could say that the crucifixion is a very violent act. Indeed it is. It's the most pain the human body can take without fainting. It's an interesting lapsus I made, fainting. So you could say that if we go back to general history of art, we can see a lot of murder, we can see a lot of decapitations, a lot of extremely violent acts, a lot of battles, people clashing. And of course, a lot of religious themes have to do with violence. A lot of religious themes indeed have to do with sacrificial mechanism and with sacrifice. And of course, a very important aspect of sacrifice is violence, be it lethal or not. In most cases, it is. So we don't have violence present in the thematic plane. We don't have it present even in a symbolical plane, or not in a way that we are used to think about it. Violence is present in action painting in the very act of painting. It's present in the action. So action, that is the part of the title. So we have this idea that artist is creating in a violent manner, that creation is violent. So when we look at action painting, examples from action painting, we see that they are to convey this struggle, they are to convey these dramas, internal clashes, and internal turmoil that artist is going through as they are creating. These processes are truly what matters. And this is where Rosenberg and Croce come together when they suggest that work of art after the fact, after the creation has already taken place, is less important. What truly matters is the process. What truly matters is the creative act. So this is why there's such a strong emphasis on action in action painting, because it's something that has a lot to do with performance that will come later and that we'll discuss later. It's something that has to do with the very act of painting being more important than the end result. Now, you can see how this is the major shift in how we see art to begin with. We have a lot of these happening in the late 19th and the early 20th, really throughout the 20th century. We have these shifts, these different ideas of what art is all about. We already mentioned that art was a lot about skill, technical perfection, and so on. And then it was about our inner drama, inner turmoil. And then it was about politics, and it was about ideologies clashing together. So we have basically different ideas of looking at art, different understandings of what art really is. When it comes to this particular view of art, we're talking about art that is redefining not just how art looks like, not just how we are supposed to look at it as spectators, but also what art truly is. And what is the value of art? So this particular perspective suggests that value in art is in the creative process, it's in the act of creation. Now, you could say that, for example, painters and sculptors, etc., of the Renaissance were very invested in skill. And skill has a lot to do with the physical act of creation. So you need to have a very skilled individual, or rather set of individuals, up to 60 people that would work together to create an exceptional work of art. So skill is really important, but focus is not on the process of creation. Focus truly is on the finished product. So we are not thinking about how difficult it was for Michelangelo to create his statues or his paintings. We can say that in passing, but we shall never say that the creative process was more important than what he left behind. This is exactly what we're saying when it comes to action painting, that these artists struggling and trying to create and trying to deliver something is way more important than what they have ended up creating. So we have a completely different focus, we have a completely different idea of what art is. And similarly to that, and very much connected to that, we have a complete shift of where violence is situated inside art. So it's not there necessarily thematically, but it is there in terms of the act of creation, because the act of creation is very violent. If you look at some videos of Pollock, for example, creating, you can see that it's a very messy affair. The whole technique is violent. The whole technique is not painting, again, in Renaissance, Baroque, classical or neoclassical style, with great precision, with great skill and care. It's throwing paint on the canvas. And so it's not really, in most cases, having the canvas in front of you so that you could paint standing up. No, the canvas is on the floor, and you throw the paint either straight from the bucket or you spray it from the paintbrush. You drip the paint. The entire process is alternatively called dripping. So it's this idea that you literally fight with the canvas, and not that you shape whatever you want with great precision and with great care. So this is a fundamental difference in where we situate violence in art. Now, I would like to invite you to contemplate the necessity of violence in art when we are talking about applied arts, when we're talking about, let's say, weapons, and how throughout history weapons were, in many cases, exceptionally well made. If you think about steel from Damascus, you think about swords, and you think about how incredibly refined and sophisticated and indeed beautiful these were made. This is something that is really important for what we're talking about today. And this is something that takes us back to the first painting we discussed, the one by Monet, the corner of the artistic studio. Because, again, we have weapons presented there, both cold and warm weapons. It's this idea that art and aesthetics in general have a lot to do with struggle, have a lot to do with violence. This takes us back to this idea, very old Greek thought that war is father of everything. So you can apply this particular thought then to Hegel and then to Marx, people who talk about the dialectical nature of all of history. And what is dialectic other than confrontation? It's a dialogue, meaning the very violent one. So we have struggle crystallizing itself as the essence of art. Now, we didn't always feel this way. You could say that Hegel is talking from a very 19th century perspective, and then, of course, in his own right, Marx is talking also from a very 19th century perspective. But for a lot of time, we didn't necessarily think that the essence of history, that the essence of humanity, and indeed essence of art is struggle and war and fight. But it is what we're talking about when we're addressing Impressionism on one end, action painting on the other, and how they come together. So we could say that in this particular case, when we're talking about action painting, technique becomes everything. Because all of the important topics of art, all of the important aspects of art are situated inside technique. Now, this is not the kind of technique we were talking about when we were addressing Renaissance art, because obviously it's not about skill, it's not about finesse, sophistication, elegance. talent and all these other things. No, it's about, again, struggle, drama, and very violent feelings that are conveyed through technique itself, and that we can feel, we can share with the artist when we witness them creating, a lot more so than we can when we are spectating the finished work of art. That is, to a certain extent, an empty artifact. But not to get into all of that again. We have this very important aspect that we need to address that is pertinent to both of these artistic styles. We are indeed talking about the notion of speed and the notion of speed of production in particular. We're talking about the fact that Impressionist artists were very much invested into creating their works of art very rapidly, very quickly. Because in their own respect, they were trying to compete with the industrial mode of production, they were trying to compete with the camera. We know that it takes way less time to develop a photograph than it does to create the painting, if we want to achieve the similar level of realism at least. We know that developing a photography takes a couple of hours. If we're talking about analog photography, if we're talking about digital photography, it takes even less. I don't know how many seconds it takes to print digital photography. So you could say that developing an analog photography or printing a digital photography is way quicker than painting, let's say, realistic painting using the classical technique, or using any other technique that will allow you the level of realism that we're talking about when we're talking about photography. The thing is that Impressionists, they were trying to rival photography in its efficiency. And they were making very, very quick paintings. So they were making paintings that were not stylistically and technically as perfect, not nearly as perfect as neoclassical or Renaissance or, God forbid, medieval paintings. No, they were creating something that was made very, very quickly. And you could say the same thing about action painting, that these were not paintings that took years to create. These were not paintings that took entire studios to create, as was the case in medieval and Renaissance periods. No, these were fruits of individual effort that would take hours rather than days, weeks, months, or even years. The notion of speed is really, really important here, because we are talking about the industrial society that produced both of these styles. We are talking about the fact that photography as invention has a lot to do with the industrial society. It has a lot to do with industrial materials, film that is used. The physical reality of film is highly industrial. And the same thing can be said about the period after World War II, when we get into the period of history that is defined by hyperproduction, industrial hyperproduction, that in the West at least has a lot to do with Keynesian model of economy. The whole thing about this is that we find ourselves in the society of abundance, or seemingly we do so. You could argue that works of art that are created anywhere between 40s to, let's say, 80s or 90s of the 20th century deal with this topic more often than not. This whole notion of superabundance, of hyperproduction, of hyperconsumption. We find ourselves in the society that is very American, which means that every family is supposed to have a TV set, every family is supposed to have a fridge and a washing machine. Something that was, of course, not the case, but the image created was such that we find ourselves in this whole new world of ease, of bliss, of comfort that is created through industry, through capitalistic industrial mode of production. Now, on the other end of the world, you have the same thing, only in communist key, but the essence of it is the same, is that this whole idea of comfort is given to us by the industrial mode of production. It's the industry that gives us this. So when we're talking about Impressionism, as well as when we're talking about action painting, we're strongly referring the industrial nature of these two societies, and the fact that these two artistic formations, stylistical formations, come from highly industrialized societies, and they're dealing with industrialization the best way that they can. So they're both dealing with speed, with efficiency, and with how little time it takes to create a work of art, because they're both dealing with the case where factories are hyper producing pretty much everything. They're churning out all of the things that used to be very costly, very demanding, and very expensive, very hard to make, very hard to achieve. If you think about very simple actions like how much time it took to do laundry back in the day when we didn't have laundry machines, well, it took a lot more time than it did once we started having those, once we started having electricity. If you think about how much time it took you to travel before airplanes became commercially usable, it took way longer than it did with airplanes. So you could say that speed becomes a very important part of the industrial society. This notion of saving time, cutting time. So when you travel, you don't think about traveling for years or traveling for months. No, you travel in a day. You could cross the globe literally in a day, or let's say 2 days, possibly, if we're talking about the 50s and the 60s of the 20th century. The world becomes much smaller. Distances become much smaller. Everything shrinks. We can talk to other continents by phones. We can talk to other continents by telegrams. Today, it's even easier because we have internet and we're even more connected. But the point remains the same, that in the 19th century, we had the telegraph, we had the means of communicating, albeit in a very reduced manner, but still with much, much greater distances, with people that were much further away than there was ever, than that was previously possible. And then after World War II, you have the same thing with telephones. And then you have the same thing with television and radio and all these other things. So speed becomes a very big deal. It's the speed of movement, it's the speed of communication, and indeed it's the speed of production. Artists feel that they have to become quicker. They have to produce as quickly as the machine does, otherwise they will be left behind. So we have the entire representation of art, the entire idea of art, change and conform to that. And this is why Impressionists are so invested in the moment. This is why they're trying to capture the moment, because more so than ever before, we have this idea of fleeting time, the time that goes away and will never come back. Time becomes denser, it becomes more observable, it becomes a very big issue. Again, if you go back to dominant economic theories of this period, you can see people talking about time, about labor, and how value is produced by using time of workers. So you could say that we have this immense focus thrown on the notion of time. And it becomes present in art. Of course, artists start dealing with the notion of time in their own manner. The way that they're doing it is that they're consecrating, they're giving far less time to production of their works of art than they ever did before. And we are saying that quickness, that speed becomes really important in both of these cases. So if we're talking about works of art that take hours to create rather than years, we can better understand why the act of creation is so painful, why it's not a leisurely, meditative, pleasurable experience anymore. No, we are hard-pressed to deliver. And this is a great representation of society that is, again, industrially capitalistic, because we are hard-pressed to create. And this is very stressful. So the art becomes about stress and struggle rather than pleasure and meditation and all these other things. So you could say that quickness, the speed of creation of art, leads us to another very important aspect of both Impressionism and action painting, and this is the void. This is the intentional emptiness of anything that is connected to substance or essence or meaning, or I would say spirit in general. We have this idea that these both of these artistic formations, stylistical formations, are explicitly about nothing. When Monet was asked, famously, we quoted this before, we shall quote it again, what his paintings were all about, he famously said, nothing. They aren't about anything. They are images. Enjoy them as images. Don't try to find any meaning in them. So it's this idea that we try to separate the realm of meaning from the realm of plasticity and visuals. If you're in the realm of visuals, don't seek for meaning. Look for that in philosophy, in literature, in other things that have to do with concepts and ideas, thoughts, etc. When you're in the realm of the visuals, look at what is visual. So look in this particular case for fight, for struggle, for drama, that is conveyed to us with visual means. If you're looking at action paintings, you are looking at the very same thing. Don't look for meaning. Quite the opposite. Look for the absence of meaning. Look for the distilled representation of fight, of struggle, of pain in itself. Now, you could say that this is a very interesting take, and this is something that would probably take an entire lecture, so we're just going to briefly address it here, is that there is a very important religious aspect of this. Now, you could say that one of the truly formative impulses in creation of Impressionist style was Orientalism, and this whole fascination with Japan in particular. So fascination with finesse and elegance of Japanese drawing, in particular also with Japanese poetry. So if you go to Monet's house in Giverny, you can see that he has beautiful gardens, obviously very famously, but he also has a lot of Japanese art inside. So you can see just how important was this influence on him. If we're talking about Van Gogh, post-impressionist, you can say the same thing. Japanese art was instrumental in forming Van Gogh. We have this whole notion that the Japanese appreciated the moment. The crux of Japanese art, visually and verbally, so when we're talking about visual arts and when we're talking about poetry, is appreciation of the moment. It's taking a moment of beauty that we would otherwise never notice, appreciating it, and then letting it go. This is of course very much connected to Japanese spirituality, with Shinto on one end, Buddhism on the other. The whole idea is that we need to be present in this moment. We need to appreciate the moment and then let it go, let it dissipate. Don't struggle to hold it. We are talking about art that is intentionally secular, that has nothing to do with the sacred. We are talking about art that is very much invested in the mundane. So there are very little Impressionist paintings, there are, but very marginally so, that are dedicated to religious themes. Most of Impressionist paintings are dedicated to what is ordinary, what is everyday, what is casual. So they are very secular and they are very mundane, explicitly so. And you can say the same thing about action painting, that these paintings are not representative of anything in most cases. So they don't even speak of things that we can recognize. They're very much abstract in this manner. But especially so, they're not about something that we can recognize as religious. And this is why it's so interesting for us to have addressed painting by Pollock that is titled War, and that has a very clear presence of a Christic figure of crucifixion, because what he will do next is completely opposite to this particular expression. He will dedicate his entire career to fighting Picasso and his vision, and this painting is very much influenced by Picasso. So the whole idea is that we want to move away from anything that is sacred, anything that is religious, and indeed anything that is spiritual. But in doing so, we are in fact nearing ourselves, we are going towards another form of spirituality. We are going towards something that can be labeled as Buddhist. So this idea that we seek spiritual gratification and we seek spiritual fulfillment in emptiness, that art is to be about emptiness, that it's to be about something else. Now, we started this whole course, and we shall go back to this in our other courses, by saying that in art, as well as in general philosophy, we have these two major principles. We have the principle of materialism and the principle of idealism. So one is that we look at the world as material, and we think that any spiritual notion grows out of matter. The other one, idealism, being that the world is spiritual, and that the matter grows out of spirit. Now, you could say that you can either favor matter, or you can either favor spirit, you can either favor the body or the soul. There's never a definitive answer to this question, and it's not meant to exist. What we are trying to say is that this particular stylistical formation, action painting sides with none of these. So it's not about ideas, it's not about matter. It's specifically not about technique, it's anti-technique, it's anti-formal, it's not representative art. So on one end, you can say it's very much anti-materialistic. On the other end, it's also very anti-spiritual because it doesn't talk about meaning. It doesn't talk about symbolism. It's very different from symbolism and conceptual art. So it's trying to find a third way. It's trying to find something that is outside of this very old dichotomy. And it's trying to liberate itself from these from this particular worldview that is very dichotomical. Yes. It's trying to liberate itself, and it's trying to step into something that is entirely new. So you could say that this particular stylistical formation, much like Impressionism, is all about finding something new, trying to carve a new path, trying to carve something that didn't exist before. So it's basically a complete difference from form, as well as it's a complete difference from idea. Funnily enough, if you're looking at this, if you're looking at all of this from the Platonic point of view, you can say that forms are ideas. So figure that. It's all about the question of time and the question of passing of time. So it's the focus on style rather than on meaning. But when I say on style, I don't really think about stylization. I think about the process. I think about the creation of art. And I'm thinking about something that clearly has to do with Impressionism, that something that clearly takes its cues from Impressionism, because it's in Impressionism where we have this first definitive statement that art is not going to be about anything important. There are many famous paintings that we associate with Impressionism that are about very banal things, like turkeys in the garden, painted by Monet. So there's nothing terribly important about turkeys hanging out in the garden in Giverny. There's nothing terribly important about people scraping the floor in the very famous Caillebotte painting, The Floor Scrapers, or women ironing shirts in Degas' Les Repasseuses. Basically, it's this whole idea that we don't want to talk about definitive things, we don't want to talk about recognizable things, we don't want to talk about concepts. So whatever starts with Impressionism, this radical and drastical turning away from importance and great topics and stylistical perfection, is taken a couple of steps further in action painting, because it's a drastical separation. It's a drastic separation from anything that is recognizable and anything that has to do with concepts as well as with style. So it's all about emptiness that allows us to step into something new and unexplored. So you can see how this is very comparable also with works of Malevich and works of Kandinsky. These are two, of course, major influences on this type of art. So we could say that this is something that corresponds well with the second half of the 19th century, as well as it does with the second half of the 20th century. I want to explain this a bit better, although we are going over the time that we've dedicated to this. We said it was going to be an hour. It's going to be a bit more. It doesn't really matter. We're talking about this very peculiar zeitgeist that is present in the end of the 19th century, and its analogous zeitgeist that is present right after World War II. When we go back to the end of the 19th century, this is the pinnacle of Impressionism, let's say 70s and 80s and 90s of the 19th century. We are talking about a very divided period. I'm not just talking about the class divide, the age of robber barons with the age of great class stratification of phenomenal wealth on one end and phenomenal and dire poverty on the other. I am talking about the way that people saw the world. In specific, this coexisting optimism and despair. So what I'm talking about is how the industrial process and how the industrial revolution has shaped the world. So on one end, we had people that saw the industrial revolution as disastrous, because in many ways it was and it still is. It's something that's destroying the environment. It's something that is bringing on the global warming. It's something that basically devours natural resources. It's destroying forests and fields, creating enormous amounts of pollution. Now, whether you believe in global warming or not, it doesn't really matter. You can say that we are witnessing basically extinction level event on a very large scale. And this is not something that is debatable, really, that many species were eradicated, that many species have gone extinct, that 90% of all of biomass that exists on planet Earth has to do with humans and human-related animals. So we have taken over 90% of the entire biosphere, which, of course, very, very important, and I would argue dramatic. So we are talking about this whole idea that industrial process is devouring nature, it's destroying nature, and is changing our landscape. If you compare European landscape before and after the Industrial Revolution, you will see two very different things. You will see great levels of pollution. If you look at 19th century London, especially second half of the 19th century London and the London as it was before, you can see that there is this whole culture developed around soot and then respectively a whole culture that has to do with whiteness, why we appreciate white linen, white gloves, white shirts, because there was soot everywhere and you could clean yourself as much as you possibly wanted, you would still end up covered in soot. So people who had white linen on themselves were basically socially distinguished. They could afford to wash their clothes I don't know how many times a day. So you have this whole obsession with whiteness developing out of this heavily industrialized, heavily polluted cultural and indeed social context. So we can say that there is a very important change in the scenery. So there are many people who are not quite optimistic, quite the opposite to that. They're very pessimistic when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, because at the same time we have terrible working conditions, child labor, we have people working in factories for 14, 15, 16 hours a day, no weekend. You can imagine the whole story. If you want to learn more about it, you can do the research yourself about working and living conditions in the second half of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So we have this point of view that speaks of the world that is basically starting to look like hell, quite literally. On the other end, we have people like Count Saint-Simon, a very influential thinker in the 18th and the 19th century, someone who is extremely enthusiastic about the industrial process. So someone who thinks that industrial motor production is so incredibly efficient, so well thought of, that it will bring forth absolute abundance for everyone. It will create so much product, so much goods, so much wealth and value that everyone will be a billionaire, literally everyone. It will eradicate all social divisions. It will eradicate all social stratification. You could argue that Count Saint-Simon was what we today call a utopian socialist. And what is really interesting about this figure is that he was very influential to both communists and capitalists of its time. You could argue that Karl Marx famously was a Saint-Simonian, or at least he was at the beginning of his career, beginning of his philosophical development. But on the other end, so were the brothers Pereire, these very famous investors that worked in Paris and that basically invented, economically speaking, the world we live in today. It's a very interesting story about brothers Pereire. We'll talk about them some other time. So you could say that Count Saint-Simon was very influential to people that belonged to completely different camps, ideologically speaking. Both of these thought that industrial process was going to save the world. It's going to create paradise on earth. So we have this situation where one and the same thing is inspiring drastically different sentiments. One people think that it's creating heaven on earth, literally. The other people are thinking that it's creating hell on earth. And interestingly enough, they both have a point. You can see both of them being right to a certain extent, or at least you can say that they have reasons, valid, solid reasons to feel this way. On the other end, we can talk about the same situation after World War II. It's the world after 1944, more specifically after Bretton Woods Agreement. So it's the world of Keynesian economy and something that we call the welfare state, not only in Europe, but also to a great extent in the United States of America. So we have this whole idea of post-world prosperity, post-World War II prosperity, the golden 30 years or the glorious 30 years, from second half of the 40s to second half of the 70s. And this is basically the period with unprecedented level of wealth creation and wealth distribution, which is also a very important thing. So this is the period where we have progress like we've never had it before. Like we have the possibility that seems almost fantastic today, that with minimum wage, one minimum wage, you can have a house, you can have a family that has more than 2 kids, and you can educate those kids, and this can really all work out. So this was all possible with one minimum wage. I know it looks completely unimaginable today. The whole idea is that this particular period in a certain part of the world, you could argue in the first and the second world, so the Soviet Union on one end and the Western Bloc on the other, was all about unprecedented wealth and wealth distribution, was about great levels of comfort, was about available healthcare and education. So truly we had it better than we ever had back in the day, which again was mostly thanks to the industrial mode of production. On the other end, this was also the world after World War II, which means that it was the world after the Holocaust, the world that was dealing with the consequences of the Holocaust. It's the world after the first deployment of atomic bomb. It's the Cold War. It's the witch hunt, the famous McCarthyan era in the West, if you will. So it's this world where we live in constant fear that nuclear warfare is just around the corner, and that we all have very good chance of, well, perishing, that humanity is on the brink of destruction. So again, you have these two polar opposite points of view, that on one end you say, well, this is unprecedented level of wealth and comfort. This is truly amazing. It was never as good as it is now. But on the other end, you're saying we're all doomed. We are literally going to destroy ourselves. So it's very comparable if you look at this in terms of second half of the 19th century and then second half of the 20th century. We have a very similar situation happening. And of course, we have a reflection of that in the realm of art. So we have the very similar dichotomy operating for Impressionism as well as it does in action painting. Now, I really want to bring this together by mentioning a very, very important essay that was written by Wolfgang Paulin, hope I'm pronouncing this right, on totem art. And it's the essay that gives us a very different insight into action painting and what is it all about, what is its purpose, what is its goal. So it's talking about this new revolutionary, provocative, daring art style as basically going back to the very fundaments of creation, to the very fundamentals of our civilization. It's talking about this as if it was totem art. And we know that totemism is a very, very early take on the sacred. Again, I'm not using the term religion quite specifically. It's a very ancient belief system. So he compares this moment of creation that action painters are engaged in as the ritualistic, ecstatic fervor that shamans would have back in the day. And he connects this creation of the work of art with a totem. So for him, this has a very, very ritualistic and indeed sacred value. Now, how do we connect this with what we just said, that this whole art is literally against anything that is sacred? It is against anything that has to do with holy or the sacred or any forms of religion or any form of belief. It's all about the emptiness. Well, this is exactly the point. He is talking about the new sacred. He's talking about the creation of the new form of art, and with it, the new form of belief, the new form of spirituality, really. It's everything is about dropping the old forms of spirituality and creating new ones. So we are to create out of this emptiness. We are not to stay in the emptiness. We are to create new forms, new language, new expressions, and indeed new religions. So ecstasy as a ritualistic act of creation, as ritualistic, as ecstatic, and indeed as sacrificial in its essence. This is something that I want to finish with. So I want to give a quote of all places from Wikipedia, and I just want to read this. Pauline describes a highly artistic vision of totemic art as a part of a ritual action, air quotes, with psychic links to genetic memory and matrilinear ancestor worship. So this is something to be contemplated because they see this very, very fresh, new, daring, indeed revolutionary art style as something that is trying to go back to the very beginnings of our civilization, to indeed the very beginnings of our humanity, way before we can truly talk about civilization as such. And this is something that is important to understand because this is the ambition that a lot of the stylistical formations present in the 20th century and indeed some in the 19th have. They want to go back to the basics of everything. And the reason why they want to do that is because they are aware that we are inside a very important revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And again, truly, we only have two important revolutions in all of our history. We have the agricultural one and the industrial one. And these are by far more important than French, Bolshevik, Chinese, or any other American, any other revolution that you may think of. So, I am sorry that this lecture took a bit longer than usual. Perhaps we'll do something about it when we get to edit this video. I thank you for your attention that I have abused more in this session than I normally do. And I hope to see you all again soon. Bye.